Good morning and welcome to today's Moss Adams webcast, Navigate Uncertain Times for Grant-Funded Organizations. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. Moss Adams webcasts are designed to help elevate your business performance. Transform your future for the better with advisory solutions tailored to your vision and supported by our collective technical resources. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And before we get started today, I wanted to acknowledge our big news from Monday, that Moss Adams is joining forces with Baker Tilly to create a new firm, one designed to serve the needs of the middle market. It's really exciting, and you can read more about it on our website via the link posted in the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Claire Hilleary, Director, and Megan Otto, Senior Manager. And Claire, I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Perfect. Thank you, Emily, and good morning to everyone. Just wanted to do some quick introductions here. As Emily mentioned, my name is Claire Hilleary. I am a consulting director here at Moss Adams, soon to be Baker Tilly. My experience is primarily in the external audit space. I did that for approximately 15 years, and then a few years ago decided to navigate to the other side of the realm and do some consulting, particularly in grant compliance, some internal audits, and so really happy to be here with you this morning. Megan?
Hey everyone, my name is Megan Otto. My pronouns are she, her. I am a consulting senior manager here at Moss Adams. I've been doing this for several years, providing consulting services in grant management. And before that, I worked directly at a nonprofit specialized in grant compliance for AmeriCorps programs. So really excited to be here with you all today, all the nonprofits, higher ed institutions, and everyone else that's here to join us.
Well, perfect. Let me get us started here. Here's a quick agenda just so we can guide the discussion. We wanted to start out with a quick overview of federal grant making, recap of the changes, which are many, and those key impacts to the various sectors, then navigating to strategies for changes and terminations and stop work orders we will specifically focus on. With that agenda, the objectives of today are really to explore that process of federal grant making, where are the dollars going, understanding the recent changes in the federal grant space and implications for grant management, and evaluating your risk exposure associated with this evolving landscape and what strategies you can employ to mitigate these risks. That will include, how do you apply budget planning strategies to enhance your sustainability, and then understanding what those best practices are for if you are experiencing any sort of stop work orders or terminations. So with that, let's dive right in. Really wanted to first focus on what the process is at the federal level. So this is just a quick graphic, and the process begins with the formulation of the federal budget. So each agency develops its own budget requests based on the priorities and their strategic plans. These requests are compiled by the Office of Management and Budget and the President, who then submits this budget to Congress. Congress is going to review this budget, they make modifications, and they pass appropriation bills that set the spending levels for the various agencies. And so obviously this step really involves lots of negotiations and adjustments based on those policy priorities and available funding. And so the president then has the option to veto or sign into law. Once a budget is approved and signed into law, the funds are then, distributed to the respective agencies. Each agency is going to receive funding according to those appropriations that were designated by Congress. And so then the agencies are going to make those announcements through things that are called the funding opportunity announcements, FOAs, or notice of funding opportunities, NOFOs. You often hear these just used with their abbreviations when people are speaking about them. These announcements are typically published on platforms like grants.gov and contain all the information about the grant, including what the eligibility requirements are, your application procedures, the objectives of the program. And so if interested applicants can include many of you likely at that state and local governments, your educational institutions, nonprofits, and other organizations where you submit grant proposals or applications, and these detail, how your work is in alignment with that grant or that program. And these proposals are reviewed by the agency based on the various criteria that they outline. And it could involve things like peer reviews or panels or internal agency evaluations to really assess the merit of each proposal and its alignment with those program objectives. And so based on that, the agency will make decisions with projects to fund, and then successful applicants are notified and grant agreements or award letters are issued. Then those agreements really outline those terms and conditions of your award. So for some context in today's space as it relates to the current process, the 2026 budget negotiations, they're kind of stalled right now. Their focus is on reconciliation efforts. The 2026 budget is expected to maintain a similar funding levels to fiscal year 25, which is around 1.6 trillion, especially for popular grant programs, because you need the bipartisan support. But with that being said, I have seen some proposed cuts to major programs such as HUD's housing and homelessness initiatives, as well as other humanitarian aid and some programs that fall under the Department of Health and Human Service programs that impact potentially state and tribal programs. So this is just who is impacted. Wanted to offer some numbers here of there's really over 2,000. Oh my goodness, 2,200 federal assistance programs that are listed on that sam.gov website. These can include loans, grants, and more. And, they support all the various sectors. There's over 100,000 not-for-profits in the U.S., and these organizations collectively receive over 303 billion annually. So it's a real vital component of the funding. And, in the academic realm, there's nearly 5,700 institutions that are eligible for federal student aid and participate in federal research programs. And that can really constitute a large portion of the revenue for them. And so this funding is really crucial for sustaining educational excellence in research innovation. So, this is far reaching for all sorts of organizations. I just thought this was an interesting slide. You can find this on the usaspending.gov, and it's just interesting to see where the tranches of money are going by function. So you can see the first largest group, the first five are Medicare, Social Security, defense, service of the national debt, and health. And so we don't start getting into other sorts of programs that likely many of you are responsible for until you get into those smaller budget function categories. And this is just another visual where you can kind of see the different funding in the different departments and what's been appropriated to them. Okay, so I think this is where we're getting into what's kind of going on, what's the current environment right now, what is an executive order. I think probably at this point we're all familiar with executive orders and how they've been around. For me personally, I haven't paid a lot of attention to executive orders until maybe the last 10 to 15 years, just because I think they've been used more regularly, or maybe it's just I've become more interested in them. But an executive order is signed, written, and published directive from the president that manages operations for the government. These are really powerful tools to kind of direct federal agencies and officials in doing things. But the big distinction here is it's not legislation, that their executive orders don't require any approval from Congress, and Congress simply cannot overturn them. But Congress can pass legislation that might restrict the implementation of an order, such as removing funding. So that's something to note. We're going to next hop into some recaps of changes, which there are many, and I won't go through this slew here of the first quarter of 2025 because we would just be here all day. But there's been a series of significant executive actions initiated starting in late January when the new administration took over. And they've targeted federal funding in areas such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, the clean energy initiatives, and more. And so I wanted to highlight just a few of the notable actions that have been taken since January. Some of them here are things like institutions like Harvard University faced major financial repercussions with funding freeze of $2.2 billion due to their refusal to comply with new federal guidelines. And this kind of initiated a series of legal battles with the courts stepping in to temporarily block these funding freezes. And we're seeing that a lot where these orders are being instituted, but then there is a legal challenge against them. So if you look up all of the various legal challenges to date, it's Megan and I were looking down the list, and you just have to keep scrolling because there are so many. And so I think it creates a lot of uncertainty in the grant making space, particularly because everyone's just not sure of where these things are going to land. With specific focus of more recent events, so this is all happening here in this month of April. So on April 11th, the Department of Government Efficiency has taken over operations of the grants.gov website. And this shift was part of a broader strategy to align the grant funding with current executive priorities, potentially affecting over $500 billion in annual federal funding. And so these changes include increased reviews of the NOFOs, or the Notice of Funding Opportunities, to ensure that they align with the executive orders and the priorities of the administration, potential removals of some funding opportunities, and likely delays in the grant making process. But what I find interesting is there's really been no formal announcement on the grants.gov website about these operational changes, despite previous reports of there's been access issues and unannounced restrictions that have been imposed by DOGE. So that was on April 11th. Then just last week, we had two kind of significant things that happened. On April 15th, a significant legal development occurred when a judge granted a nationwide preliminary injunction against the administration's attempt to freeze or pause funding under the key acts like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA. And so this court order kind of mandates mandates that they have to immediately resume the disbursement and payment processing for already awarded funding. And that's going to impact numerous programs that aimed at public welfare and infrastructure. So that happened last week. And then again on the 16th, an executive order was issued to overhaul the Federal Acquisition Regulations, or the FAR, which specifically was targeting procurements the orders mandating that solicitations for non-commercial products or services have to undergo a review and receive approval, pushing the federal agencies towards more cost-effective and commercial solutions. So not ad hoc or, developed specifically for them. I'll turn it over to Megan, and she's going to walk us through some of the other specific impacts to sectors.
So as Claire described, there have been a slew of changes over the last almost 4 months now. It's certainly challenging to keep up with the number of changes. I'm sure you all are aware of the ways that it's impacting your sectors, your industries, your organization. But we'd like to highlight how, far encompassing these directives are, and how many different types of organizations and industries have been affected. So to start, we want to talk about notable changes in DEI program funding. So talking about institutions having to eliminate racial preferences and DEI language with the risk of losing federal funding if they do not. Obviously, that is very significant to public institutions, higher ed institutions that receive public funding. That may mean that programs that primarily rely on federal funding are at risk. There are a lot of legal challenges that have happened already in this space, but I'd say one of the primary threats is to academic freedom. And that's been a big focus of institutions as they go through these legal challenges, wanting to ensure that educational institutes have the ability to continue to educate students freely and without the government's control. And then operationally as well, what does this mean for schools that may not have adequate funding without federal funding, without federal assistance? What does that mean for continuing to enroll students, continuing to run programs? Also, this has been ongoing pre-executive orders and has been happening in several states. I live in Texas, so I'm very familiar with the elimination of DEI offices in universities, but the elimination of DEI language across college campuses is very impactful. It means that there may be loss to very valuable resources to underrepresented communities that do rely on the support of organizations at universities. All right, and then impacts to tribal organizations and communities. So there was an initial freeze on federal grants and loans, which raised concerns on the 638 contracts which tribal entities held with the federal government. Additionally, a lot of federal workers that were supporting these grants, supporting these programs were laid off. So while these programs may still exist, the federal employees that were supporting these programs may not be in their positions, which operationally impacts their ability to disperse funding, to facilitate reimbursement of funding. And this is really challenging for tribes that may have limited resources already. There was a previous executive order that was that Biden had implemented that was intended to strengthen tribal sovereignty and expand self-determination, but that has since been pulled back. So there is a lot going on in the tribal space because these communities often rely on federal funding to support critical needs like public health needs, and lapses in fundings for a short amount of time can be really critical. So just something that we want to highlight as these funding freezes, as the uncertainty continues, they are a very vulnerable population. And then thinking more about impacts on educational and medical institutions, there was the introduction of the 15% standard indirect cost rate, which is a huge reduction for education and medical institutions, which primarily rely on being able to have high indirect cost rates to support their research. They have high overhead costs that have been covered under grants previously. So the new policy of reducing the indirect cost rate down to 15 reduces the amount of money that's available for facilities, administrative expenses. If you think, for example, a scientific laboratory at a hospital or at a college, there is so much funding that is needed to keep that lab running that you may not be seen as a direct expense and instead an indirect expense, but is integral to running that program and performing that research. So we'll talk a little bit more about the impacts of that. But I think, as we all know, advances in education and medical research are very significant to the growth and the health of our country. So this is another key impact. Okay, and then impact on green energy initiatives as well. There is an immediate pause on disbursements under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So what that means is targeting electric vehicle charging stations and broader clean energy incentives. There are some exceptions, such as tax credits. Those are still available. But there are a lot of programs related to clean energy that are on pause. Funds that had been previously obligated under the previous administration may be pulled back. And what that means, we're not really sure what that'll mean for the clean energy industry. Hopefully it's something that can be, we can get clarity on in the next couple of months, but that seems to be certainly a target in the pullback of funding. Okay, and then Medicaid cuts in the healthcare landscape. So some of you may have all have heard about Medicaid cuts. The House Republicans proposing $880 billion. I want to make sure I get that right, in cuts over the next decade. So that impacts the agency overseeing Medicaid, and then the rollover effect is reductions in healthcare funding for those that rely on Medicaid. What that could mean as an impact, increased hospital strain, increased state burden as well if there's a federal shortfall to support the healthcare funding, and then also broader healthcare impacts, so service reduction. So that may mean closure of healthcare facilities, especially in rural areas or community health centers. And then also potentially 1.5 million people losing Medicaid coverage. There has been significant resistance to this, bipartisan resistance to this. So I think there's a lot to be seen with where this will fall. There's been a lot of advocacy from hospitals and healthcare groups. So I'd say this is one where I feel like there has been more progress and more conversation around potentially not as big of cutbacks as initially proposed or discussed. So we will see what happens with this one. I feel like I'm the bearer of bad news going through all of these. Additionally, the Department of Education closure. So thinking about that and what that'll mean. The risk to educational programs, research funding, what will oversight look like for educational standards across the state as this does roll down to the state level. puts increased burden and pressure on state and local governments for ensuring that their states meet the needs of their constituents, and that their educational standards are up to a certain level. As you can imagine, this may be challenging without a national standard, and there may be significant variances, even more significant variances from state to state in terms of the quality of education, the amount of resources that students receive, and all of those. So I would say a big impact from this may be continuation of educational disparities across states. All right, and then strategies to navigate changes. And I will pass it back over to Claire.
Perfect, thanks, Megan. Yeah, so I think for a lot of you, this is probably the bread and butter, where it's interesting to understand all of the changes, to understand the landscape in that context. But really, it's kind of what can you do with your portfolio of grants, and what should you be doing in the near future. And so we've identified kind of 4 key strategies right now, which we'll go through. So knowing your portfolio, understanding your risk exposure, developing those scenarios for your budgets, and then of course, just staying on top of things and advocating for your organization. So let's jump right in here. So when we say know your portfolio, we're really kind of talking about 3 core things. So the first one is, do you know what your funding sources are? It's really kind of critical to have that up-to-date record of all your grants. This will not only help you in your reporting, but also in your strategic planning. And it should really be an inventory where you include all kind of key elements like funding amounts, your performance periods, your agency source, and maybe even things like, who is your agency contact? What is your relationship with that agency? Have you had lots of kind of concerns with them or communications with them, or is it very limited? I think from what I have seen in my experience is that outside of the single audit, maybe looking at your portfolio, you're not doing that very regularly, or organizations aren't doing that very regularly, that it's more of at the end of the year, you're getting things together. But I think that this would be a great time for all organizations to take that check and see where are the streams of revenue coming from. With that, then, just reviewing the impact of each of the awards and ensure that it aligns with both your mission and, of course, the evolving federal priorities. So, I think in some cases that the latter is going to be hard to navigate. So particularly for, if you're working in organizations whose priorities are kind of incongruent with the federal priorities currently, we're helping lots of our various clients in those sorts of spaces. And so in those contexts, I think this third part will become particularly important if you are in an organization that seems somewhat misaligned. And that's with regard to your future planning. And so using your current grant portfolio to anticipate what are your future needs, and that's going to really help smooth your transition as things change. So understanding risk exposure, what do we mean by that? That is essentially, any organization, regardless, is going to have gaps, or it's going to have areas that maybe could be improved upon. And if you don't really know where those gaps are, if you don't know where your weak points are, you could potentially be exposed to greater risk. And so how do you identify those things? You need to understand where they are, and you can do that through a variety of things like internal audits. So many audits can be a rehearsal of sorts for your external sort of audits, and really help you identify and correct or put mitigating strategies in for any sort of deficiencies early. So being very proactive in knowing what your weaknesses are. With that, skill gaps. So, you need to make sure that your team's skills and capabilities are really, really strong. And, I think especially it's going to be important for organizations to do some cross training to make sure that you are ready for new challenges. If there is turnover or reduction in workforce, that you don't want one person knowing, all of these processes, but not knowing these processes and this person leaves, that you need to have those redundancies built in. And that is combined with your policies and procedures. I don't know if you've heard webinars with me and just my experience. I harp on good policies and procedures because I see it so often where if things are not documented and there's attrition and there's turnover, the new people coming in have no guidance and no structure to know what they're supposed to be doing. And so I think it is a real risk exposure for organizations that are not using those and really making them living organic documents that are looked at regularly and updated to really help facilitate all of your operations. So developing budget scenarios, this is going to be, I think, pretty key, where none of us know what's going to happen in 6 months. None of us know where we're going to be in a year, but we can try and plan for the various scenarios. And you want to look at it from the best case to worst case scenario, where you are developing plans for those potential funding cuts or exploring different ways for cost containment strategies or finding operational efficiencies, that you need to kind of think about each of these areas and really sit down and say, if this was to happen, what would we do? What does this look like? And what would the budget be? And kind of develop those core things. We see this a lot, for instance, in like your IT, that I would imagine a lot of you have like a disaster recovery plan. And this is kind of the disaster recovery plan in the context of your financial and operational goals of really saying, when the fire alarm is pulled, does everyone know what that means and where people should go and what that looks like? And having developed these various scenarios, I think will really help facilitate that. In doing those budget scenarios, what I think is important is, firstly, you need to start probably looking at these things now, but then don't just put them in a file and not look at them for another year. That I think that this is going to be another living sort of document that you're going to need to look at and address regularly, because just these past few months, I think just trying to navigate and understand the implications of the changes and what they mean, it has been so fast. And so you really have to stay on top of that. The other piece of this is really engaging all of your stakeholders as part of that process. So don't just have it as your management. You want to include your board members. You want to include financial advisors, your key staff. And I think that also just lends itself to some transparency. And this goes to the third part of the communication, that if your organization as a whole knows that you are working collectively to try and forecast what the various outcomes are and what the impacts would be to your organization, I think that is going to be much more palatable in the long term for all of the employees, so that they feel informed and understand what the strategies are for your organization as you move forward. So communication, always a best practice.
Okay, and then staying informed, always very important as a grantee. My advice during this time is a little bit different than what I'd say in previous years, but subscribe to updates from relevant federal agencies and associations. Typically, I'd probably say check that agency's website, get on their RSS or email listing feed. But we have noticed that a lot of news does come from social media, so from an X account, from a Blue Sky account. LinkedIn is a really big source of information. I would say follow agencies where you have funding, follow nonprofit organizations, follow coalitions, pay attention in that manner. So that way you are getting information as soon as possible and you can act accordingly. And you can implement what you need to in terms of whether it's a specific budget scenario, whether or not you need to notify subrecipients of any changes, being on top of the ball and receiving that communication as soon as possible may be key during those times. And I would say engage in industry forums, workshops. If you do have the opportunity to attend conferences, get out there in person, that's great. But also there are a ton of virtual resources that are available. I know I see different workshops or webinars almost every day popping up about changes that are happening. So without driving yourself into information overload, those resources are there. I've seen LinkedIn be a huge asset and just making sure that you are following those agencies and then any other commentators. I will say for court cases as well, there are some major newspapers that have some directories of all of the court cases. You can click on those and it'll redirect you to the actual docket if you'd like to stay up to date on the status of the legal case, and you can read through what's happened up to that day. All right, and then advocacy. So as the majority of you, I presume, are federal grantees, you likely understand the difference between advocacy and lobbying. But during this time when compliance is so important, want to make sure that we emphasize the difference between advocacy and lobbying, ensuring that you have effective communication strategies with policymakers. So whether or not those are your lawmakers in your area or federal lawmakers or lobbying institutions, understanding whether or not you're advocating or understanding whether or not you're lobbying. This allows you to represent the needs of your community and those that you serve. But as I said, we want to make sure that we do it compliantly. So what that means is that when you are on federal grantee time, you should not be lobbying. That is unallowable. So one thing that you'll want to do is, if you do plan to engage in direct lobbying, grassroots lobbying, attempting to influence legislation, whether or not that means going to your state capitol, going to Capitol Hill, I would say making sure you have very clear time and effort records of that you were not on federal time, you were not charging to a grant during that time, and that you're representing your organization and not representing that grant. Advocacy is, I would compare it to outreach. So ensuring that individuals know about the services that you provide and then the impact of those services as well. So educating the community on what your organization or what your institution is offering, what you've accomplished so far, what it would mean if funding is cut to your programs, and the potential impact on the community. So understanding those differences are key, because we don't want to get into a gray area where you are lobbying and you are on federal time, because that is not compliant. All right.
Yeah, so with that, I think this is where I see a lot of maybe your effort should be spent. So once you understand what the landscape is, what the scenarios are, now it's time is to start looking for opportunities and diversifying your portfolio. So trying to reduce your dependency on federal funding can really provide some financial stability and flexibility. Partnerships with private entities and foundations really can open up new funding avenues and collaborative opportunities. So once again, just keeping an eye on those emerging priorities of the new administration, such as technology and sustainability, and try to align those funding strategies with those areas, I think is going to be really important. what I will say is, I've seen just in talking with people and also just seeing in news stories that a shift to, say, private funding has been happening where some of the private foundations, they're seeing a real uptick in the asks and the requests of some of their funding. And so having those conversations early, starting that now, developing those relationships now, if you're going to be looking for non-federal sources and maybe private sort of funding, is going to be really key. But you want to get ahead of the game because, everyone is looking at this, everyone has that uncertainty. And so you want to try and set your organization up for success by starting that now. And with that, how do you do that? You really need to start thinking about how do you illustrate that your organization is the best organization to receive the funding. And that's done in a variety of ways where you really need to understand how you best demonstrate the impact to your communities or the programs and projects that you're doing or you want to do. And that has to be a story. It has to be compelling. It has to be supported by, the tangible work that you're doing. And so really thinking about how can you tell your story as your organization that is contributing to the overall impact of whatever it is that is your key metrics is really important. Some organizations have entire, groups or departments that are really focused on how they evidence that impact. And so if you don't, that's definitely something that you'll want to think about and really how do you sell your organization that it's successful. In alignment with that, I think then are the two other areas of the financial transparency and the accreditations and ratings. And this just kind of really is to help prove and evidence that you as an organization have the key controls, the metrics, the tools to really run a smooth operation, and that the mission and objectives of whatever award that you're anticipating or wanting to get is can be done and completed in an efficient way. And so this goes back to the policies and procedures piece, the internal controls. Do you have all of those tools in place to make sure that you are a well-run, well-oiled organization that has all of the things to make sure that your financial systems and your financial audits and single audits, all of those things will be clean? If you don't, that's definitely an area you'll want to work on, because I imagine there'll be lots of competition for awards in this space. And so to some extent, we're all kind of having to make sure that we're working at our best levels. And then with that, the accreditations and ratings. So anything you can do for your organization to obtain the accreditations, certifications, even at the staff and employee level, start thinking about that of how can you set yourself apart to really kind of highlight and emphasize that you are the best organization, you are the best employee, et cetera, that helps really sell that story is going to be really, really key.
All right, and what to do if a grant is terminated? Because this is a reality that some grants are being terminated. This is something that you can do prematurely. You can have a contingency plan. You can plan ahead. My number one piece of advice here would be to know your agreement. Make sure that you understand the terms and conditions of your grant, when and how your grant can be terminated, knowing what the potential appeals process would be if your grant was terminated, and then understanding what closeout costs may be potentially covered. Those may be specific to your grant, so knowing that your agreement in this case is especially important. And then in addition to knowing your grant, knowing what your internal and what your external communication plan is going to look like, knowing if your grant is terminated, who are the key stakeholders that need to be in the room to talk about what the next steps are going to be. And then from there, thinking about who you would need to communicate to depending on the grant, seeking outside legal counsel, notifying individuals, talking with your program officer at the agency, what would be your steps? I would say if you have the time right now, go ahead, put that plan in place. Hopefully you won't need to use it, but if not, you have it there ready. And then if there is a stop work order, understanding what the allowable costs are, we have them listed below, and these are generally what the allowable costs are. So please reference your own grant agreement and make sure that you understand what the allowable costs are per your agreement. But communication with subrecipients and suppliers about the stop work order or about your termination status, covering costs that cannot be immediately halted, such as if you have supplies that are already in transit that you ordered a week before. Contract termination costs, so you may be in a contract that is related to your grant and it may need to be terminated as a result of your grant stop work order or termination. And then consultant fees, you may need a consultant to help with the closeout of the grant and preparing for the termination. And then unallowable costs. So pre-termination losses, so any costs overrun or losses that were incurred before the termination date. Any costs related to employee downtime without efforts made to redeploy, and then post-notice commitments. I've seen this one hit organizations really hard, but expenses from new commitments made after receiving the termination without approval. Please be in contact with your grantor, your program officer, if your grant is terminated or if there is a stop work order before you incur additional costs, and make sure you have that communication documented as well. So key things are document communications and decisions, communicate with your key stakeholders. So talk with your board, talk with your executive leadership, talk with all of your employees too. If there is a grant termination or a stop work order, ensure that you have an internal communication plan to employees, as this may impact their jobs. And then ensuring that you're consulting with your legal team as well. In terms of documentation, I would say if your grant is terminated, track your time still just as you would if your grant was not terminated. Track how much you are spending, even if you are not planning to charge it to the grant or cannot charge to the grant at that time, because there is so much legal action going on. There is a chance that you may be able to retroactively claim these expenses. So you want to make sure that you have clear records of the time that was spent and any expenses that were incurred. Okay.
So I think we have a few minutes to open it up, and I saw a couple questions that were asked. So one of the questions was, let's see. Because communication during uncertain times, what are the strategies to ensure clear communication with the stakeholders along the way that does not incite fear or an exodus? And that's a great question. I think, of course, this is a hot topic right now, and I think there are a lot of emotions involved, regardless of, whatever your political leaning is. And so I think it's important to really just focus on objective facts and things that you can control to some extent, that you don't want to incite the fear or the anxiety, but there is uncertainty in this landscape, and so we are all trying to navigate that. So I think if you can frame your communications with your stakeholders, with your staff, with your vendors, all of them, that you are working to navigate these things, and that here is what we know, and leave it at that. Try to remove the emotion components out of it and just say, this is the strategy we are taking. These are the reasons here. I think that is the best method that, we are all kind of working to try and understand what that looks like. But I always lean back of the communication piece and that transparency of just saying, look, I don't have the answers, is always better than potentially not saying anything and then, organizations feeling like they didn't receive proper notice. That it's always better to kind of know information as it comes at you.
I think related, there's a question here about, will we be notified if our grants are terminated or pulled, or do we have to look this up ourselves? You will receive a termination letter or a stop work order if your grant is terminated or the stop work order occurs. I would say, however, we have seen that those notices have not gone out in a timely manner in some instances. There's one instance that I'm aware of where retroactively an agency was notified on X date that their grant ended 5 days prior. In that instance, there is legal action, very unclear about what the next steps will be, but I would say try and stay as informed as possible, keep in touch with your funders, but you will receive that termination notice or the stop work order. Just try and stay as proactive as possible with that communication.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to that, when you're developing or doing your inventory of your portfolio and you identify your agency contacts, that would be a great time to indicate, have you contacted them? Have you reached out to them? Have you, if you're not often in contact with them, that's something that you probably want to do and start doing regularly so that you do have a pulse on that and you do have a resource for the various agencies so that you can get information hopefully quicker and not be blindsided by something that comes with a date, as Megan mentioned. Someone commented that grants now with HRSA require memos and description fields to be filled out for why funds are being drawn down. We are seeing that with several agencies, that there has to be a justification and also kind of they want to understand what the money is being spent for. So, that's something to consider of how you can document these things in a way that is compliant and still kind of maintains your funding sources. Let's see here. Question, with the federal government placing restrictions on DEI language, should we approach foundations and corporations with neutral language? I think that's an organizational choice or that you all have to make. I think there, once again, is so much uncertainty. We've seen this, I've been asked questions with the minority and women-owned businesses where that language has to go in contracts and the criteria, selection criteria, that there's preference given to those, and people are asking whether or not that should not be done. And my response has been to that until there's actual legislation to that effect that negates what is currently legislated, I would continue doing what you're doing because some of these things, because they are in the judiciary landscape, that until they're litigated and until the legislature passes bills or things to the contrary, that you should continue doing what you're doing with the legislation as it stands today.
I would add to take that on a case-by-case basis as well, and to reach out to the prospective funder. If they have scoring criteria, make sure you're reading that thoroughly, but asking them, is this something that would be a benefit to my application, or is it something that would not add value to my application to include this?
One other question, let's see, with the continuing resolution, what's the potential timing for Medicaid cuts? Unclear. As I said, the 2026 budget is being developed now, and there are lots of back and forth with that. And so I think more to come. I definitely don't have that answer. I don't think anyone does at this point.
I see a question on consultant fees for closeout. Would this include legal fees? I would reference the specific language in your agreement, and I would contact your funder on that one for clarity and have it documented.
I think that there is one question here. Do you consider employment agreements as contracts for allowable contract termination costs? Potentially, yes, but again, I think as Megan mentioned, you really want to reference whatever that specific is, the language, and it's going to be a case-by-case basis that each one of these kind of looks a little bit distinct.
You always say there's a lot of intricacies with that. You know, it's the state that you're in, is it an at-will state or not? The interpretation of the word contract with employee agreements. So unfortunately, not a clear-cut answer on that.
I think just to be sensitive to time, we'll pass it over to Emily.
All right. Thank you, Claire and Megan, for a great presentation today. We can still take questions and we'll follow up with you after the webcast. You can also reach out directly to Megan or Claire via their contact info in our speaker bio widget. And here's a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Please also visit mossadams.com for future webcasts and other resources to help you elevate your performance upward. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.